All right, so I wanted to take a minute to kind of explain the making of Sonic the Hedgehog Pinball Panic and talk about, how I incorporated gameplay ideas from the classic Sonic games into the pinball machine. And the first section will be kind of how the idea came about. I was talking to one of my friends who's also a pinball fan, and we were talking about how it's weird that during the classic 8-bit and 16-bit era of video games, Mario got not one, but two physical pinball machines built. Both are by Gottlieb, and this was the first. It's the yellow model, and it's a little bit smaller than an actual pinball machine. You can see in the back full-size pinball machines. I don't know why they did that. Maybe that was so, shorter kids could reach and play the game. But then there was also the blue one, which I haven't played in real life. I have found the yellow one, and it was also by Gottlieb. What makes this stranger is that both Sega and Nintendo were arcade manufacturers. They had the distribution channels to physically build games and ship them to arcades. Nintendo didn't make this one, Gottlieb did. I guess they were a contractor. But what's even weirder is that Sega actually made arcade games. You can see the classic Sega letters there. They also made this Baywatch machine. You can see the Sega logo on the sides of the cabinet. But the idea of Sonic and pinball go back all the way to the beginning. In the very first Sonic the Hedgehog game, there was Spring Yard Zone, and it has kind of pinball-like bumpers and ramps, and you can turn into a ball and, fly through them. In Sonic 2, that idea was expanded on with actual flippers and more styles of bumper elements. In Sonic 3, the bumpers come back in Carnival Night Zone, but the flippers are not there, as far as I know. And in Sonic CD, both the flippers and the bumpers come back. But what's even more is that there was a spin-off game, no pun intended, called Sonic Spinball. I really enjoyed this game as a kid, but the tables in this game couldn't be made physical. They're not perfect rectangles and they're really intricate, so they're not really physical based, but they do take a lot of inspiration from actual pinball machines, such as the dot matrix display along the top. Sonic got another pinball game called Sonic Pinball Party for the Game Boy Advance, another attempt to try to pinballify Sonic. I haven't personally played this one, but, it's another pinball crossover with Sonic. And then in the Sonic Generations game, that was a game where you have the classic Sonic gameplay and the modern Sonic 3D gameplay. But one of the mini games was another pinball. This game was by Sega, so another attempt to turn Sonic into a pinball game. Of course, the graphics look very cartoony. And for the pinball simulation software, Future Pinball, someone made a Sonic the Hedgehog 2 table, which we'll take a look at here. And again, the graphic style is pretty, cartoony, pretty, looks like a video game, really. And I'm not sure if it's related to the actual Game Boy Advance game, but also for Future Pinball, there was a Sonic Pinball Party table. And we can see that here. And it looks like the same table, right? But now it actually has the Sonic Pinball Party logo in there. I'm not sure if this table is actually in the Game Boy Advance game. Like I said, I haven't played that one. But it's another attempt to turn Sonic into pinball, but the graphics still look very video game-like. Now, it would be a lie to say that Sonic never got a physical pinball machine. The guys from Virtual Pin, which is another pinball simulator, made a one-of custom Sonic cabinet, which we can see here. Now, this was never in production, so I believe it's the only one of its kind that exists. But this was based on some of the later games. If you look closely, the Robotnik is kind of based on the Dreamcast Robotnik. There's a Shadow the Hedgehog, which was also Dreamcast and later. And while I haven't played this table myself, just looking at it, I feel like it doesn't have a lot of the elements I decided to include. But I was definitely going for the classic Sega Genesis Sonic gameplay in the 90s, based on the Sega Genesis games. So while this is cool and I would love to play it one day, it wasn't really kind of the vision I had, because I was going for the 16-bit and 18-bit era style games. There were two toys made. I did have this Sonic Pinball toy as a kid. I enjoyed it, but obviously it's not a real pinball machine. And there's also this more simple one, which I've never played, but again, very simple, just a couple bumpers. So I thought it was interesting that Sonic never got a physical pinball machine. So my goal was to make that a reality. So I tried to incorporate as many of the classic Sega Genesis Sonic gameplay as I could. And the first thing I thought about was how a classic side-scroller works. For better or for worse, the point is to go from left to right. So you start somewhere on the left, and as you go right, there's a number of enemies or obstacles that you have to encounter and pass. So here's an example of the dot matrix display for the game, and we can see there's a grounder, a masher, caterpillar, a loop, Robotnik, and the egg capsule. And the idea is you would go for these targets on the pinball table, and as you'd get them, they'd fall off, and you want to go from left to right. So here's the actual machine. We can see that grounder right there. We can see the next target you want to go for is the masher. So you'd want to get all three of these drop targets, and then that icon would disappear. Then you'd go for the caterpillar, which is over here on the other side. 4 drop targets, one for like each body segment. A little bit more challenging. Then the loop, which obviously is right here. And finally, Robotnik over here. We'll talk more about how Robotnik system works in detail later. And at the end of every Robotnik fight, you have to hit an egg capsule. And if we rotate Robotnik around, we can see he's designed so that the back side of his, toy or component on the table looks like one of the classic Sonic egg capsules. And again, we'll talk about that more later. So the idea was to go from left to right. Now, the other concept in Sonic is that you have multiple zones. Each zone has a different theme, music, and is more difficult. So on our table here, there's these indicator lights on the table which shows which zone you're in. So right now we can see Zone 1 is lit up, and which act you're in, and we can see Act 1 is lit up. So right now in the 3D model it's not too obvious, but in renders, like you can see here, it's much more obvious which one is lit up. So the basic premise of the pinball machine is you're given a series of targets that you want to hit from left to right, and as you complete them, once you're done, either the act will increase to Act 2, or you'll go to the next zone, Act 1. Over here it also shows which current target you're going for. So in addition to the dot matrix display, in this case showing a grounder and a spinner, the spinner being this guy right here, you can also see your current target lit up, like the grounder here, in this section. So if you're not looking at the DMD and you're focusing on the table, you can see what you're supposed to be shooting for, and after you've completed that list of target, you've gone from left to right and completed either Act 1 or Act 2. Now, at the end of every Sonic game, in this gameplay footage, at every Act 1, you have to hit the spinner, and like we talked about, there's a little goalpost spinner here. So you simply just have to go in on either side and spin that guy around. And at the end of every Act 2, as you can see in this gameplay footage, you have to fight Robotnik. And every time Robotnik has kind of a different pattern and different machine and everything. So this Robotnik element has different things and phases he can go through, but that's the basic core idea of the game. You're in a zone. It's a list of targets. If you're in Act 1, you finish it by hitting a spinner. If you're in Act 2, you finish it by defeating Robotnik. So I also thought about some other basic Sonic elements. Of course, I had to have a loop in there. So I modeled that in as an element of the gameplay. And Sonic is also known for having springs that go, boing, and launch the ball around. So I put a spring right there. Now, another element is in Sonic 2, there is a slot machine. And that's what happens if you hit this kick-out hole right here. And here's some gameplay footage from Casino Night Zone in Sonic 2. And you can see Sonic goes through 3 kind of like, golden bars, and the slot machine spins, and then you get a prize depending on what the slot machine says. Now, in actual Sonic 2, these are the combinations that can win. And some of them make sense, like 3 Sonics, 3 Tails, whatever. And then you get the according prize, like 30 rings or 25 rings, whatever. But then there were some combinations that were mix-mash, like 2 jackpots and a Robotnik give you, you lose all the rings that you've accumulated, or 3 bars, you get 20 rings, whatever. I decided not to do the mix-mash combos. So for my machine, you always have to get 3 of a kind. And you can see here some gameplay footage of the slot machine in the Pinball Panic table. And I made the rules a little bit easier, so get 3 of a kind. Also, because there's a million different combinations you can make, it was very unlikely. I think it was 1 in 256 or something like that combinations you can get. So it was pretty rare that you would actually get 3 of a kind. So like the Sega Genesis game, I do kind of nerf the logic. So I think it's a 1 out of 4 chance you'll get 3 of a kind. So 25% of the time you'll get a match. And which match you get is random. And Sonic, in this, I changed also the prize. Sonic gives you, I think, an extra ball, because that's what happens when you hit the power-up icon. Tails gives you, I think, 25 rings. Robotnik, you lose 50 rings. The bar gives you, I think, 30 rings. Three of a Kind Tails gives you, I think, 20 rings. And I think that's it. So I changed the rules a little bit, but I did want to incorporate that slot machine, and I thought that was a perfect use for a kick-out hole on a pinball table. Also, you can see in the actual Sonic gameplay, there are those 3 bars with like little stoppers around them, and you fall into that, and that's when the slot machine plays. And for my game, you can see I have kind of 3 metal bars and some bumper posts on both sides of the kick-out hole, just to kind of recreate that same element. And if we look at like the different types of sprites and everything, I did my best to recreate these as DMD graphics. Obviously with the DMD you only really have 3 colors and black, so you have black, dark, light, and bright. So I did my best to translate those icons, those sprites, from the actual slot machine in Sonic 2, and that's what we have here. So that's a little bit about how the slot machine works. Now, another element I took from the Sonic games was the idea of collecting rings. So scattered around the playfield, you see these ring lights. And the idea here was when the ball rolls over a ring, you'll hear the ring sound effect. And on the dot matrix display, there is a ring counter. And if you look at a classic gameplay footage, if you have rings and you get hit, instead of losing a life or, ending the level, you just lose your rings. And so in the pinball machine, if you drain the ball, we can see from the top view, there are spikes on all 3 drains. And in the pinball machine, just like Sonic, when you drain, instead of losing a ball, you'll lose your rings. So the dot matrix display will show a graphic that looks like this. That says ouch, and there's a bunch of rings flying everywhere. So that makes the game a little bit easier than a lot of pinball machines. As long as you have a ring in your possession, you can drain the ball and you get to keep playing. It won't take one of your balls. So that's how I thought to incorporate rings. Another way you can get rings is from this power-up monitor. If you hit this monitor while it's displaying the ring icon, you'll get 10 rings. And another way to get rings, obviously, is the slot machine. You can win rings from there. So as long as you have rings in your possession, you'll be able to save the ball when you drain. So I guess the next thing we'll talk about then is the power-up monitor. So there's 2. There's this one right here. There's another one hidden behind this pile of rocks, and we'll talk about that pile of rocks later. But there are 2 power-up icons on the pinball table. And there's multiple different icons that can be displayed on the power-up monitor. So let's talk about that. We have the following. We've seen rings. That gives you 10 rings. The next one is the shield. The way the shield works is pretty simple. Between the flippers, it says ball saved when lit. And if you hit the power-up icon, the power-up monitor, when the shield is being displayed instead of rings, you will get a ball save. So that icon down there will light up, and if you drain, you'll simply save the ball. You won't lose a ball. You'll be able to shoot again. There is the Sonic icon. And in the actual Sonic game, that gives you a free life. So in the Sonic pinball table, that gives you a free ball. There are the invulnerability stars. And I have some gameplay footage here, but basically the idea is the stars on the table will flash, and there'll be like 20 seconds of invulnerability. The Sonic invulnerability music will play. And during that 20 seconds, the ball will be able to drain as many times as you like. So there's no penalty for draining the ball. You won't lose the ball. You'll be able to relaunch. So just like Sonic, if you have invulnerability, it doesn't mean anything. You can't lose a ball. The next one is the shoes. Now, the shoes was an interesting concept. Later in the video, I'll talk about more ideas I had for the shoes. But during the Sonic gameplay, the shoes basically make you run faster. So the way that I thought to translate that to the pinball machine is during the time that you have the shoes, the flippers will hit harder. And I wanted to make this based on a real pinball machine that could be physically built. So the way I thought to incorporate that was by making the flippers hit harder. So as long as you have 20 seconds worth of speed shoes, these flippers, the solenoids inside the table, would like have more power or voltage or amperage or whatever. So the flippers would hit the ball harder, so it would shoot faster. Now, I don't know how useful that is in actual gameplay because it changes the mechanics. If you're used to making shots in one way, having the ball go faster would completely change the physics of the game, but it does mimic the Sonic gameplay, so that's what these shoes do. You get 20 seconds of shoes. You can see some gameplay here. The dot matrix display is counting down from 20, and as long as the shoes are enabled, you can hit the ball faster. Unlike in vulnerability, if you drain the ball with the shoes, you lose this power-up. The final one to talk about, I suppose, is Robotnik. In Sonic 3, this power-up was introduced, and when you hit it, you lose rings. So, you lose rings when you drain the ball, but if the power-up icon is displaying the Robotnik face, then you would also lose rings. You don't get a drain or anything, but you would lose whatever rings you have. Now, the next element to talk about is Knuckles. In the Sonic canon, Knuckles was supposedly lied to by Robotnik and told that Sonic is the bad guy. So, Knuckles is introduced as a character where you don't really know if he's a good guy or a bad guy. And throughout the game, he's always messing with you. So, in this footage, we can see Knuckles hits a gray switch, and then the bridge collapses, and Sonic falls into the next zone. And this is a reoccurring theme where Knuckles will hit a switch and then somehow mess with Sonic. To incorporate this idea, I put a gray switch underneath Knuckles, and every time you hit that switch, this particular bridge on this series of habit trails will rotate up or down. And if it's in the down position, the ball will hit this ramp and go all the way to the right flipper. But if it's in the up position and you hit the ramp, the ball will fall short and you'll be able to hit it with this flipper. So just like in the Sonic games, Knuckles will change the environment to kind of change where Sonic goes. And then there's also these knuckle letters, and every time you hit the gray switch, you'll get another letter spelling Knuckles. Now the first time you do it, you'll get a special ability. In this gameplay footage, we can see that Knuckles can break through these piles of rocks, and Sonic and Tails cannot get past this barrier. So in the pinball machine, I decided to do the same thing. Once you've completed all of the Knuckles letters, they're all lit up, then you'll be able to hit this extra drop target, and when you do that, it'll fall down, and you'll get a free, another chance at hitting a power-up icon. And it'll stay down, I believe, between levels, and then you'll have to hit it again on the next level. So that was another way I incorporated kind of the Knuckles gameplay. Only Knuckles can defeat these, so once you've completed all these lights, you'll be able to defeat it as well. And every other time that you complete the lights, you'll get, I think it's a 10,000 point bonus or something like that. I also deliberately put Knuckles next to Robotnik because in the game they're kind of tied together. You defeat Robotnik and then Knuckles comes and messes with you. So they're physically close to each other. He's got that heh on the side of the cabinet, and he does change the environment by, moving this bridge up or down to change where your ball will go. Of course, I also want to get some Tails action in here. Now, as we can see in this gameplay, Tails mostly is known for being second player and being able to carry Sonic. So Tails can fly, and he can carry Sonic, and at any point Sonic can jump off of Tails and, land wherever. So the way the tail system works is when you launch the ball, you can launch the ball at various levels of power, depending on how far you pull the plunger back. And it will shoot through this alleyway and go behind Robotnik, and it will go to one of these skill shot lanes. And as you go through the skill shot lanes, the Tails letters will light up. Once you've completed all of the Tails letters, this habit trail, bridge, or ramp, or whatever, will rotate over like that. Now, if you hit the ramp and you go left, the ball will continue down this ramp into Tails' basket. And if you look up close, you can see there's a little basket underneath Tails, and Tails kind of has the ability to go along this rail. And if your ball is in there, he'll carry you. So I wanted to get that carry mechanic copied over. And if the ramp is in this position and you don't have all the Tails letters yet, When you go left, you'll fly over and land on one of the skill shot lanes, but you won't go along the habit trail, so you won't be able to use Tails. And once the ball is in Tails' basket, you can see some gameplay footage here. Hitting the ramp, going through the habit trails, and landing in Tails' basket. Now, if you use the left and right flipper buttons, Tails will move along those rails, and you can position the ball wherever you want it. There's no time limit, you just move him left and right. And when you push both buttons at once, he'll drop the ball. Now, I'll go into more detail later about how that mechanism works, but that's how I thought to incorporate Tails. Like in the actual Sonic game, once you unlock Tails with these skill shots, he'll be able to carry the ball left and right. You can drop the ball anywhere you like, so you can line up the perfect shot, basically. Originally, I had these rails planned to do a more intricate, course around the table, but for reasons and time and complexity, it was too sophisticated to try to bend these rails and worry about how the system would work. Again, keeping in mind that I wanted to build this in such a way that all of this could be built with real physical pinball technology from the 90s. So I didn't want to do anything crazy like, in video games, sometimes pinball machines can do things that are simply unrealistic. So I did design a complete mechanical system for how Tails works, but we'll talk about that later. But that's how I got Tails incorporated. And I guess the final character is Robotnik, and so we'll talk about him next. Alright, so let's talk about Robotnik. Now, in the actual Sega games, like I was saying, every time he has kind of a different contraption, so the battle is a little bit different, but you just have to hit him a bunch of times until you defeat him. And so I wanted to recreate that same gameplay where every time you beat Robotnik in the pinball machine, it's a different battle. And sometimes he has defenses like these little egg shields. So in the pinball machine, in the first level, Act 2, all he does is rotate left and right. He's completely open, so the only thing you have to do is hit him 6 times to deplete his, health bar. Gameplay where every time you beat... In later levels, he has, for example, these drop targets, and these act as a shield. And as you can see, the sprite was inspired by that. And once you hit these, they drop down, they don't come back. But now you actually have to hit these drop targets before you can hit him. So it makes it a little bit more difficult because now you can't just directly hit him. So that's an extra level of defense. And then in even later levels, he has a flame, which can rotate out in front. And so now when he rotates left and right, there's a flame in front of him. So you can really only get open shots from the right side or from the left side. But if you try to hit him directly, the ball will bounce off the flame. Now I thought about making it so that the flame would cause you to lose rings, and maybe I'll still do that. But right now, it's just another defense where you can't hit him because if you hit this, you'll bounce off. And of course, you could end up in the situation where the drop targets are up and the flame is out. So now you first have to defeat the drop targets, and once they're dropped, you still have to avoid hitting the flame because you won't get clean shots on him. Another mechanic is these holes right here. Now, it's kind of hard to see in Blender, but I do have some gameplay footage. But right here we have this ring, which is normally under the surface of the board, and it has 3 cutouts. And as you can see, as it rotates, it can open these holes or close these holes. So these are kind of based on the idea of spice shakers, where as you rotate the cap, it'll either reveal holes or close them, depending on the rotation of the cap. You've probably seen something like this before if you ever bought a spice shaker from the supermarket. So normally this is not above the surface, it's actually below the surface. And if we turn on rendering real quick, you can see right now all 3 of these holes are blocked. But if this were to rotate like this, you can now see that these 2 holes are open. And if you were to try to hit Robotnik, your ball might hit him, but then it will immediately drain, and you'll lose a ball, or you'll lose rings, or whatever. So he'll periodically rotate this disc. I'll bring it up again just for clarity. So he can open and close drain holes in front of him. So he'll have 3 total attacks, or 3 total defenses. Not only does he have the flame to bounce your ball back, he also has a shield to, reflect the ball until you knock those drop targets down, but he can also open and close the holes in front of him. So there's 6 total zones, and every zone gets more and more difficult to defeat Robotnik because he will enable combinations of these, and of course zone 6 has all 3 enabled at once. So getting a clean shot on Robotnik means dropping his shield targets, avoiding falling in the holes, and also avoiding bouncing off the flame. So the Robotnik battle for each zone in the pinball table does get progressively harder, which I'm pretty proud about because that gives you multiple ways to try to interact with Robotnik, and it's just not the same thing of hitting him every single time. So he has defenses, and he also has offenses like opening these holes. Now, after you defeat Robotnik, then in a typical Sonic game, as you can see in this gameplay footage here, you have to hit an egg capsule. So in Sonic 1, it looked like this, and you jump on that, and according to canon, it's full of creatures that are about to be roboticized to turn into badniks or whatever. In Sonic 2, it looked like this. In Sonic 3, it looked like this. And so I incorporated that by making the backside of Robotnik look like an egg capsule. So if you're looking at it from the front of the machine, it looks like the classic Sonic egg capsule. And of course, on the dot matrix display, it'll be showing the egg capsule icon, and on the pinball machine, the egg capsule will be lit up. So that's kind of like the Robotnik cycle. You defeat him, he has different defenses every time you try to play him, and then after you defeat him, you have to hit the egg capsule. Now, the next element to talk about is the special stage. So here we have a star post, and in Sonic 2, if you hit the star post with 50 or more rings, you'll enter a special stage, and in Sonic 3, a bonus stage. But I decided to use the star post as the special stage for this pinball machine. So if your dot matrix display shows 50 rings or more, and you hit this passive bumper target, then you'll enter the special stage. Now, in the latter Sonic games, when you go to a special stage, it'll say something like this: get blue spheres. So, if you get blue spheres, you'll get a Chaos Emerald, and I decided to incorporate that mechanic as well. Here we have a series of drop targets which are normally hidden. But if we take a few of those and bring them up, it might show something like this. And if you can hit all 3 of these targets without draining the ball, you'll be given a Chaos Emerald. And down here we can see that there is 7 Chaos Emeralds, and 1 will light up. Of course, to beat the game and have a good ending, you want to have all of these Chaos Emeralds. So, every time you hit the star post with 50 rings or more, it'll give you blue targets, and every level will have more blue targets. And the latter, special stages will have more targets, so even after you get all 6 of these drop targets, new ones will pop up. And if you can successfully get all of them, you'll get a Chaos Emerald. And once you've completed all of the Chaos Emeralds, you'll be able to unlock Super Sonic. And the way that works is once you have all the Chaos Emeralds, and you hit this star post with 50 rings or more, you'll have invulnerability until you run out of rings. And in the classic Sonic games, when you're Super Sonic, you'll lose 1 ring per second. So you have 50 rings because you hit the star post, and you basically have 50 seconds of invulnerability, which means no matter how many times you drain the ball, or you fall in a Robotnik drain, you do not lose the ball, and you keep playing. So you have 50 seconds of invulnerability. If you hit the slot machine or the power-up monitor, or you get more rings from the table, that will increase the time that you have before Super Sonic runs out. So it's basically the same thing as invulnerability, except it's based on how many rings you have instead of based on a 20-second timer. So there is incentive to get Super Sonic, because if you're going for Grand Champion and you want to get the high score, then having Super Sonic means every time you have rings, you have invulnerability, and you can keep playing and keep going for targets and goals and keep advancing the game and getting a higher score. So I guess the final thing I'll talk about how I incorporated Sonic into the pinball table is the graphic elements. So on the sides of the cabinet, you can see I have different textures painted. And the first one is Emerald Hill Zone. I did make this as a vector graphic, so this is not a screenshot. And In front of Emerald Hill Zone, you'll see two physical toys that do nothing, but they just, they're there for style. A sunflower and a totem pole. These were taken from Green Hill Zone in Sonic 1, and you can see like a comparison of my pinball table versus the Sonic 1 sprites. And as we move to the right, there's also a palm tree, which is inspired by the Sonic 2 palm trees. And of course, you have the fish drop targets, kind of a river, a wood bridge, and a loop with the classic brown checker pattern. And this was also inspired by Sonic 2 and Sonic 1, and mostly elements that you would see in the first stage of a classic Sonic game. As you go to the right, you see Casino Night Zone, and this tile pattern again I drew in Illustrator, so it's not a screenshot. You can see the vector graphics, and the background is Casino Night vector graphic I drew. And because Tails is a background tile for Casino Night Zone, and I have the Tails skill shots here, and of course you enter Tails right here. Also the slot machine was in Casino Night Zone, so it's right here. And of course, if you look at a screenshot, the bumpers have that kind of red, ring, and then a blue fill with a white star. So these bumpers were also based on Casino Night Zone. So this whole kind of corner is just themed around that. And then as we move to the right, we see the Marble Zone elements. So if you look through the background, you can kind of see some of the Marble Zone background through the holes. But also this little temple thing was based on the Sonic 1 Marble Zone, and you can see a screenshot here, and it looks just like that. And that Marble Zone wraps around to the side here. And in this kind of corner, there's like a purple tile on the floor, which again is based on Marble Zone from the actual game. But underneath Robotnik, there's a pattern. Again, I drew an Illustrator based on the Scrap Brain Zone pattern from Sonic 1, because that's kind of the last level in the game, and kind of, metallic and robotic and kind of themed to Robotnik. So underneath him, he has the Scrap Brain Zone. We have the purple tiles from Marble Zone, and the background is another vector graphic of Marble Zone. So as we go over here, the last and final zone that I really took, influence from as far as like the sides of the cabinet is Hydrocity Zone. Now, Hydrocity Zone is typically an underwater zone, so I didn't want to use any of those graphics, but there are parts of Hydrocity Zone that are above the water. So you can see these kind of columns and arches, and this was another vector graphic I drew based on the game. You also have this like tower of like spinning lights, and this Badnik that was from Hydrocity Zone, and they're just placed there as kind of static, decoration toys on the table. And as you move to the right, you can see there's kind of like this dust trail with like, spirals of dust. And if you look underneath here, there's like a little bit of flame on the ground, kind of like Back to the Future. And during this alleyway, when you launch the ball and it flies up here, you can see it says zoom. So, you launch the ball, and it's kind of like Sonic's moving so fast because you launched it. And, there's dust being kicked up on the side of the cabinet with a little fire trail and everything. So that's that. And then to incorporate one final zone, the lanes for the flippers or for the drains have the chemical plant zone, I guess, I don't know what you call them, ramps or, elements, whatever, that texture. Again, I made it in Illustrator, so this is a vector graphic and not a screenshot. So both the flipper lanes have influence from chemical plant zone. And like I mentioned before, there's spikes, a classic Sonic element. So when you drain, it does play, when it rolls over the trigger here or here, it will play the spike sound effect. And, that's just more Sonic theming. And I guess finally, in the early Sonic levels, there's always kind of like a water zone and a river. So I drew this river in Illustrator. I drew these logs in Illustrator to kind of create that log bridge and everything. And one concept I had was, if Sonic runs fast enough, as you can see in this gameplay here, he'll actually run on top of water. So when you hit the ball over the river, that's kind of why I put these water trails, to imply that you're not going to fall in the water. You're just kind of going so fast that you're going to go over the water. And because the water feature kind of goes into this tunnel or drain or canal or whatever, I put these kind of like motion blur kind of things to kind of imply that you're actually jumping up onto this next surface. Of course, it's completely flat. It's just part of the texture. So for the graphic design, just for fun, I had these two elements where it kind of implies you're going so fast that you run over water. So I put 2 of those where it's kind of you're going so fast you jump up onto this next surface, even though in real life it's a completely flat surface. So those are some of the ways I thought to incorporate some of the graphic design and language of the Sonic games. If you hit the spinner, it kind of has like these concentric rings to imply it's spinning or whatever. But yeah, that's how I incorporated some of the levels and some of the graphic design from those levels, including both 3D models like the totem and the palm tree, as well as the 2D graphics like the background for Casino or for Marble Zone or for whatever. So yeah, that's the last influence from the actual Sonic games that I put into the machine. So I guess we'll wrap up like the kind of gameplay element section with a couple other things that aren't necessarily specific to Sonic gameplay, but I thought I should mention about my machine and kind of how I designed it. So the first thing is the loop bonus. As we can see here, there are 4 letters, spells loop. Every time you hit a loop completely, it'll light up another letter. And when I say completely, I mean you actually have to have enough force to go all the way to the top and then through the other side. So if you have, if you hit the shot kind of weak and you like fall early, that doesn't count. You actually have to complete the loop at full speed. And if you do that 4 times, you'll get 10,000 points or something like that. Another kind of mechanic I put in there that's not specific Sonic gameplay are these free ball lights. So sometimes, right now it shows Robotnik, but sometimes, the table will show the spinner as the last element in the act, and the spin goal arrows will kind of flash back and forth. But if you hit the spinner when it's not the target, you'll light up a free ball letter. And if you can do it 8 times, you'll get an extra life or a free ball. But it's important to note that you do have to hit these. You have to hit the spinner 8 times without draining the ball. So the ball has to be in play the entire time. And if you hit the spinner 8 times, you'll get a free ball. But if you do drain, even with invincibility or supersonic or free ball or the shield, these will reset. So this is not per act, this is per ball. But if you manage to get 8 times on the spinner per ball, you'll get a free ball. The other thing is, as I mentioned before, there's this kind of ramp habit trail thing that can rotate left and right, and by default it's to the right. But if you can hit this left ramp, what's going to happen is you'll fly off the ramp and you have a chance at landing in one of these skill shot lanes depending on how hard you hit the ramp. And I thought that was kind of a fun gameplay mechanic from a pinball design perspective, because normally the only way to get the skill shot lanes is to either launch the ball and try to aim for one by how much power you use, or if you get it into the bumper zone, a bumper might knock the ball through one of the lanes. So I thought it would be fun if the ramp can also feed those lanes. So if you really want the tails mode, you can kind of go for the left ramp shot, and hopefully you'll be able to get those lanes to light up the letters and get tails. And when you do fly past this ramp, it'll play the sound effect of Sonic jumping, because when Sonic jumps, he makes that like whoop sound or whatever. And so it's kind of like you're flying off the ramp, you jump, and it gives you another shot at the lanes. And I've never seen that before in a pinball machine. It might exist, I don't know. But I thought that would be fun because it gives you more chances to hit those lanes, and there's 5 letters you have to complete, which is kind of a lot. So it makes it more fun, and that was just another mechanic I decided to include. But it's not really related to Sonic gameplay other than the fact that it plays the Sonic sound effect when you fly off the ramp. Alright, so this concludes part 1 of the making of Sonic the Hedgehog Pinball Panic. Now, the first time I recorded these videos trying to kind of document and show behind the scenes of Sonic the Hedgehog Pinball Panic, I ended up with almost 4 hours of footage. So I think I'm on my 3rd take now, and part 1 is 40 minutes, and I'm pretty happy with that, but ultimately I decided I have to break it into 2 parts. So far we talked about how the idea came about. We talked about how I incorporated the classic Sega Genesis Sonic the Hedgehog gameplay into what could be possibly a physical pinball machine, and as well as some other, pinball gameplay mechanics. And in part 2, we're going to talk about some abandoned ideas that I had. Now, I wanted to make sure that this pinball machine could A, be physically built, and B, was kind of spec to the 90s era. So I had some pretty interesting gameplay ideas, but
they would either really only be possible in 2018, or they wouldn't really be practical from a maintenance perspective. I do believe they would be physically possible, but not necessarily practical. But I do want to share those ideas, so we'll start off with some of the ideas that I decided not to incorporate, and then we'll go a little bit more technical in part two. We'll start off with how I modeled the pinball machine in Blender. Not too much to say there because there's nothing really specific about a pinball machine that's different than modeling anything else, really. But I'll talk about some of the challenges I had and some of the design decisions I had to make the model and also bring it into Unity. And then we'll talk about Unity. And originally, I was not expecting to make this an actual playable pinball game. But I kind of got, sucked into it. And I found a really kind of clever and weird roundabout way of making this game. So I think you guys will enjoy that, especially if you're an engineer. Even if you're not an engineer, you might still get a kick out of it. So we'll talk about Blender first, and then about Unity and how I kind of engineered the project. After that, I'll do a brief section on the intro animation. So, Sonic plays, or he puts a coin in the machine, pushes start, pulls the plunger, etc. I'll talk a little bit about how I do that animation. Again, there's nothing too special there. It's just, an animation. But I'll talk about how I did that. And finally, we'll wrap up with some self-criticism. Now, I've already spent about 2 months on this project, and I see a lot of places where I know I could have done better and where I know there's room for improvement. The problem is, if I had unlimited time, I would easily spend, another 2 months on this project just polishing it and making it the best I could. But it really comes down to a time budget where, I can't really afford to spend more time working on this project, but there's places where I know I could do better, or things that maybe I don't know how to do better, but I wish I knew how to do better, and stuff like that. So I have a lot of things that I kind of want to talk about self-criticism, where it's like, well, yeah, I know, I should have done this better, or whatever. But the thing is this is just one project of many, and in a future project, those criticisms will be things that I actually implement. So, and then we'll just kind of wrap it up with an overall conclusion about the scope of the project and everything. So, it's currently December 2018. If you're watching this in December 2018, it'll probably be a few weeks before part 2 comes out. I already spent a lot of time editing part 1, and the project has actually been done for a couple weeks now. I've just been delaying the release because I wanted a video ready. So the video ended up a lot longer than I was expecting, so it's going to be in parts. But realistically, probably if you're watching this in December 2018, part 2 will probably be in January. Realistically, I have a lot on my plate right now, so I'm going to take my time to edit part 2. There's so much to talk about too, so it's hard to edit because I can't really cut anything out, but it's so dense. There's so many things to talk about. If you're watching this in the future, then part 2 is probably already out, and go have fun watching that. But anyways, yeah, this has gone on long enough. We're almost at 15 minutes now, so I'll see you in part 2.